Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford, and today I want to return to a well-worn topic, the poem Hávamál, but specifically I want to talk to you about what is going to be new about the edition and translation in my book coming in fall 2019 called The Wanderer's Hávamál. Having wandered up high in grizzly country today myself is actually a pretty appropriate time to be talking about this. So let's take a look at the Wanderer's Hávamál in sort of a table of contents. You have an introduction in which I discuss the context of Hávamál, thoughts about its origins, the meter, some stylistic things, the language of it, how we might be able to date it or establish what region it might come from, sort of anything that I could think about to throw in there that people are curious about with Hávamál. Then you have facing page Old Norse text with my English translation, followed by my special English translation called the Cowboy Hávamál, in which I put the first part of Hávamál called the Gestaþáttur into my grandfather's voice. Then there is a selection of related poems, including Eiríksmál and Hákonarmál, which are about dead kings arriving in Valhalla. There is the poem Darraðarljóð, in which Valkyries weave with spears while they determine the fates of men in a battle. And there is a section from Gautreks saga, in which a man is symbolically and then really sacrificed to Odin. There is also a full commentary on the stanzas of Hávamál, focusing on questions that a person of no experience with Old Norse to moderate experience with Old Norse would have questions about. And there's also a glossary explaining all of the names. Now, let me get into a little bit more detail about the Old Norse text, the translation, and the commentary, because that's really the meat of this edition. Having the Old Norse text there next to my English translation, which I've never done before in previous published books, allows you to take a look at the undiluted Old Norse text, the original that I'm working from. The commentary also gives me the room to explain why I might make a particular choice in my translation, but also how other translators have made other decisions, or how you, reading it yourself in Old Norse, might come to a different conclusion entirely. When there are particularly difficult lines in Old Norse, I explain as literally as possible what they say, and then explain how I derive the more fluent English reading of my translation out of them. And in the latter part of this video, I'm going to give you a preview of some of what that commentary will sound like. Now, what is the Old Norse text like? You might notice that if you pick up, an edition of Neckel and Kuhn off of the bookshelf, or a very recent edition by Jonas Kristjansson and Vésteinn Ólason off the shelf, or just Google Hávamál Old Norse text or something like that, you're probably going to see three different things. Why is that? Well, the manuscript there's only one manuscript that contains Hávamál, the Codex Regius, the Portic Edda. So you wouldn't expect there to be that much variation, perhaps, right? But Old Norse scribes use a lot of abbreviations, and typically those abbreviations are not used in printed editions of the Old Norse text. So you've got to start with that. But then there's also the fact that there is no standardized spelling for Old Norse, right? So different scribes might write, or the same scribe might write the same word three different ways inside 2 pages of the original Old Norse text. So you have to decide whether you're going to spell it exactly like how the scribe spells it, which is often quite varying, quite inconsistent, or pick some kind of standard to follow to help the modern reader who has access to dictionaries that use what we call classical Old Norse spelling or orthography, which is a compromise based largely on manuscripts in the 1200s, together with a little bit of the conventions of modern Icelandic, plus, of course, punctuation, because commas, periods, things like that, even consistent capitalization, are hard to find in the original Old Norse text. So what I do is I standardize the text to that classical Old Norse so that you can look up words in the typical dictionaries that are available to students, such as the Cleasby Vigfússon or Geir Zoëgas. So for instance, in stanza 40, one half of that is fjör síns fengit hefur skillit maður þorf þola. And so I'm showing you there both the manuscript spelling and the standardized spelling that I make use of in my edition. Note that I do use the rune for maður to stand for the word maður in places where the Old Norse original does, because in fact the Codex Regius manuscript, especially in Hávamál, often uses the rune that looks a lot like the Greek letter psi, maður, to stand for the word maður, man or person. So I've left that in because I think it's an interesting part of the text and an interesting aesthetic. So you'll see that, which I don't believe is in any other edition of Hávamál that's printed. And I also don't artificially archaize the text. I take the text for when it was written, so it is in mid-1200s Old Norse with some more archaic features. There's a lot of Norwegianisms and possible regional Norwegianisms in the text. If they're particularly interesting, I leave them in and I explain them in the commentary. And I don't try to make the text look older than it is. So one of the things that you'll see right away in some very old editions, which are usually the ones you'll find for free on the internet because they're public domain, is that they archaize the text and make it look like an older stage of Old Norse than it is actually written in. One of the main things you'll notice is that archaizing editors take the particle, which is really a filler word, and replace it with of, because that is probably the older filler word, the older particle, because older texts tend to have more of than But I leave of where the Codex Regius has of and or the Codex Regius has because I don't feel entitled, I don't feel privileged to tell the native Old Norse speaker who wrote this down what word to use where. And there's quite a mix in the text of Hávamál. I also don't take the words, the forms of the word to be, vera, such as is, and var, was, and turn them into their more archaic forms with s, vesa, s, and vas. However, there are several places in the text of the Hávamál where s is abbreviated just an s, and that of course is much like how we abbreviate is, a closely cognate word, to just an s in English contractions such as it's, that's, what's. So I leave that in with an apostrophe to indicate the contraction. Now, let's talk about the translation into English a little bit. My attitude is that, well, there's two main statements to my attitude toward translation. One is the experts don't need a translation. I'm not translating this for other people who have a Ph.D. in Old Norse. I'm translating this for people who need the English translation to understand the text. So I want it to be accessible to anyone who is accustomed to reading English, right? But I also don't want it, that's, sometimes people assume that must mean that this is, that it's simplified in some way. It isn't, but it's regular English, right? I'm not trying to make it sound particularly old-fashioned. It's not trying to make it sound Shakespearean or Chaucerian or Victorian. I am just writing in early 21st century plain English so that the meaning comes across. That's the other part of my attitude toward translation. I believe that if you need a glossary to read it, it's not a translation, right? If you are translating something in English, an English speaker ought to be able to pick it up and understand what it means, at least as much as the translator understands what it means, right? There are certainly very difficult stanzas of Hávamál. Of course, the commentary talks about that quite a bit. So the commentary, again, is designed around the questions that especially early learners of Old Norse might have. So let me read you a stanza of Hávamál. I'm going to read you stanza 32. And I'll give it to you in the Old Norse text as it's printed in my translation. Then I'm going to give you the version of my translation of this stanza that is in my original published translation of Hávamál in the Poetic Edda, Stories of the Norse Gods and Heroes, published by Hackett in 2015. Then I'll give you the new translation that's going to be in the Wanderer's Hávamál. This will give you also a sense of the places where I have changed my translation from that translation. Now, why have I changed my translation in some places? Well, I did my original translation of Hávamál in 2010, so it's been 9 years. That's 9 years of reading, researching, and ruminating that has changed my opinion about some stanzas, or allowed new facts, new ideas to come to my attention, or simply having the commentary there to explain myself with, I feel more at liberty to just translate the Old Norse text more literally in some places, where without the commentary in that original translation, translating it really literally would have made it much harder to understand if you didn't have the commentary to turn to explain the meaning. All right, so stanza 32. Gumnar margir, erusk, jagenhollir, enat virdi rekask. Aldar roog, that mun vera, orir gester, vid gest. My original translation read, many men are kind, but can be driven to fight. There will always be conflicts between men. Where there's more than one, there's a fight. Certainly captures the spirit of the stanza. The new translation follows the wording of the original Old Norse more closely. Many men are kind to one another, but will fight at a feast. There will always be conflict between men. A guest will fight a guest. So in the original, taking the sense, taking the notion that Hávamál is applicable to sort of any person's life, any person's human interactions, I translate this without the specific mentions of feasting and guests. But since the original stanza is clearly taking place at a feast, at virdi, and is a fight between a guest and a guest, gester and guest, I translate that more literally now instead of in the sort of general notion of conflict between human beings. Now, Hávamál often sort of liberally calls any human being a guest, gester, but I feel like with the commentary there and the Old Norse text, the original there for you to look at, this way you can kind of draw your own conclusions about how to apply the specific scene of the stanza more widely. Now let me read you the commentary to that stanza so you can get a sense of what you can look for in the commentary. Of course, for different stanzas there's more or less to say. Some stanzas there's not really anything to say because they're so clear, but here's this commentary for stanza 32. Line 3 does not alliterate as it is preserved, but it does alliterate if the last word is amended to vrekask. In fact, this is strong evidence that the stanza is much older than the manuscript, as vrekask, fight each other, would have been the form of rekask before the regular sound change of VR to R had occurred in Old West Norse, which had occurred already before circa AD 1000, based on alliteration patterns and datable skaldic poetry. Compare English rek from the same root, with WR cognate with archaic Old West Norse VR, also still seen in East Scandinavian today, in Swedish vrak, rek, Danish wow, rek, from the same root. In line 2, erusk is a rare example of the reciprocal suffix sk used on a form of the verb vera, to be, thus are to each other. The reciprocal suffix is also seen in line 3, in rekask, fight each other. A literal interpretation of line 6 reads simply, a guest, gester, fights, orir, against, with, a guest, guest. I rendered this with a more universal interpretation in my earlier published translation of this line, where there's more than one, there's a fight, but render it with plainer words closer to the original here, which also better maintains the scene of the original stanza at a feast where two guests have gone from friends to enemies. Now let me also give you a taste of the commentary on stanza with some different questions, something that a learner of Old Norse might wonder about in particular. This is the first half of stanza 41. Vopnum och vådum skulle vinner glädjask, that å sjálvum synst. In line 3, synst is the superlative of the adjective syn, visible. Thus a very literal reading of the line is, that is, most visible, synst, on, å, selves, sjálvum. Now the reason that I point out places like that in the commentary is because I know that you see something like synst, and it looks a lot like a modern Icelandic, a medial passive suffix, right? You might think that this is something like thinks or seems based on modern Icelandic seenist, but I want to draw your attention toward the actual Old Norse form that's there rather than what you might be tempted to think of based on a very common word and of course the closer related descendant language, modern Icelandic. So I hope this whetted your appetite a little bit for this book. I mean, there is a lot more than that when you consider how many stanzas there are, when you consider how wonderfully interesting and diverse the text of Hávamál really is. I mean, you go from advice to Odin sacrificing himself to Odin's magic spells. You have his stories of love, his failure to seduce Billing's daughter, and his success at seducing Gunnlod to acquire Odhrir, the mead that makes its drinker a poet. It's a really fascinating text, and I'm very glad to have this opportunity 9 years after my first look at the text to give you a thorough tour of Hávamál as seen through the eyes of someone who has loved it and studied it for getting on 2 decades. Well, if you enjoyed this video, I hope you'll check out some of the other videos on my channel about all aspects of Norse language and myth. I hope you're looking forward to the Wanderer's Hávamál. I'm certainly looking forward to seeing it this fall. And from beautiful Wyoming, let me wish you all the best.